Why is it that this plant has way more flowers than that plant? Well, it actually comes down to pruning. So today's video, I'm going to teach you how to prune to get maximum yields. And what I'm going to tell you is going to shock you because it's the opposite of what the internet says, which is kind of my vibe. Us here in the Geek Crew, we are garden heretics. Welcome to the outcasts of the gardening society. The choice for pruning comes down to what producers on a large scale can do to get the most marketable tomatoes. Okay, so what that means is, if you did not know, the produce you see in the grocery store is very specific. They want it the same size, they want it uniform, color, flavor, they want it all identical. And so in order to achieve that, we invest a lot of science into breeding as well as cultivation practices that will allow us to essentially replicate that plant and the produce it produces over and over and over again. So the way that we do this is through pruning. Makes sense? So with that being said, it may work for you as a gardener who doesn't care what the tomatoes look like. Work out that you don't want to prune by the end of this video. Ultimately speaking, be your own garden scientist, Geek Crew, do whatever you want to do, because the best way to figure out what works for you is to just do a little bit of everything. So don't just dogmatically take on whatever somebody says. That's number one. Number two, it depends on the tomato you have. So let's go over the two types of tomatoes that I'm very sure you're all familiar with, but ultimately do have different pruning practices. So determinant is number one. We all know that determinant only grows to a certain height, and that height doesn't necessarily have to be a compact like a red robin. A determinant tomato can get up to the 4 or 5 foot mark. So great example of this is Romas and San Marzino. Oh my God. This is why you shouldn't listen to anything I say. I can't speak. Romas and San Marzinos, those two are determinant tomatoes, which means they benefit from a very specific form of pruning, and most definitely do not, for the love of God, do not remove the suckers on these. They do not at all benefit from sucker removal. So what do you do when you have a determinant tomato? So first off, it comes maybe down to how you're trellising. There are two kind of best practices when it comes to trellising determinant tomatoes. Number one is a tomato cage, because tomato cages aren't indefinitely large and they're not really meant to hold indeterminate tomatoes, but they work great for a Roma or a San Marzino. They work wonderfully for that. So a cage. Now, what we look at when we see a lot of the studies done is the Florida weave method. Now, the reason for the basket weave or the Florida weave method being used actually comes down to the fact that it's cheaper on a large scale when producing tomatoes to use a basket weave or a Florida weave. Now, this method can also be used for indeterminates. However, if your indeterminate gets drastically higher than what you can achieve height-wise with the Florida weave method, you want to consider topping. So if you live in a climate, there's many of you from much warmer places than I am on this channel, which, I mean, the takeaways from the channel work for anybody, not just Canadians. So if you're in a warmer climate, you may choose not to do the Florida weave method because the stress on that stem kind of flipping over, and combined with maybe some pruning practices that you may choose to adopt after we're done this video, it's not the best. It's not the best for an indeterminate tomato. If you are Canadian, or someone in northern US, Europe, you may choose to do the Florida weave method with an indeterminate tomato and then top said tomato. So if you're new to the Geek Crew, what you may not know is that oftentimes your tomatoes aren't ripe before the end of the year. Now, that can come down to the depth in which you plant the tomato. So this video here kind of goes over that in a little bit more detail, but it also can come down to the fact that it's just a cold climate and we unfortunately just have a short growing season. But the way to mature the tomatoes and flowers that are on the plant is to top your tomatoes at around the 3 to 4 weeks out from your first frost date. So for me, that would be around the end to middle of August when I choose to top my tomatoes. This exponentially increases the maturity of anything below the topped portion, and therefore with the Florida weave method, it isn't uncommon for us to only maybe make it to the top of that and a little bit higher because of how short our growing season is. But if you have a longer growing season, I probably wouldn't go with the Florida weave method, only because you would eventually top or cause that level of stress. And we'll talk about what you should be doing later, but just a heads up there. Okay, so say you choose the method that causes the least amount of stress on your determinant tomatoes, and that is the Florida weave method. What you want to look at is two options. Option number one is to prune the suckers and to prune the lower leaves. However, big however, you will reduce your yield. That is a fact. That is a known fact. So the reason why your yield is reduced is because those suckers produce flowers and those suckers also produce fruit. And eventually you can have a lot of leading stems, all of which produce fruit and help with photosynthesis. The reason why you would prune a determinant tomato actually comes down to the fact that you're concerned about disease. So if you know you have blight issues, if you know you have, some sort of fungi issue, all spurred by moisture and lack of airflow, it's probably in your best interest to prune. If you've never had issues with any of that, then I would just leave my determinant tomato. I wouldn't prune any of the suckers. I'd leave all of them on, let them be leeches, and you'll be kind of shocked by the yields that you get off of aroma. It's literally shocking. Last year I did this. I pruned aroma and then I left aroma. It was double. It was literally double the tomatoes. Okay, so the other option, and this would be the option that I choose, and again, you don't have to listen to me. You don't have to do anything I'm telling you to do, but that is to remove all stems and leaves below your first fruit cluster. So you would go find your first set of flowers and then you would prune everything below that. The purpose of this is just to kind of keep the leaves off the soil, which will help prevent disease without reducing the yield that you find with the sucker removal on a determinant tomato. Okay, option number two is with determinant tomatoes. And I would argue that these are probably the more common of the tomatoes for the Geek Crew. And what you would want to do here in an ideal world is puppeteering. And puppeteering is what I use for my determinants. Honest to goodness, it makes a big difference. The Geek Crew over on the Facebook group, they've got some really, really unique methods for puppeteering. They've got them on rollers and way more sophisticated than what I do. So if you want ideas on really cool ways to do this, neat and tiny ways to do this, go check that out, because they do a lean method. So essentially what that is you puppeteer it and then you slowly over time, once it hits kind of the top of the trellis, if you will, you let out a little bit of string, which allows the tomato to kind of sink down, and you end up getting more footage of vine that way without having crazy tall 15-foot puppeteering trellises. So it works wonderfully. You just have to be careful with it, and that's why you would use like a roller, which is again what some of the Geek Crew do, and they're way better at it than I am. I always say this. The Geek Crew smarter than me. Okay, so this is where things get cool. For the world of indeterminate tomatoes, there are a lot of looks we've done. So what we look at here is leading stems. What that is leading edges or main stalks, if you will. So 1 leader is what we are used to, which is one single stem that goes up. Okay. The other one is 2 leader. So that is one that goes up and then one that's actually a sucker that you just chose not to prune, and that goes up. Okay. I have seen it done in a way that I don't love and actually really sets back your production, and that is actually topping of your tomato seedlings. The idea here is the same as if you were to top like a Cosmo flower. you chop it off and then you get 2 edges. What I would prefer is you do just wait for that second leader to form as a sucker and then allowing it to grow while pruning the rest, if that makes sense, because topping, it's like an instant stop and then it has to figure its way out. Whereas if you just leave the single leader alive, then that will do its thing. It'll likely produce tomatoes much sooner than your second leader will, but you're not setting yourself back. Nothing wrong with topping of a little baby seedling. It's just if you're particularly Canadian and in a cold climate, I probably wouldn't do that because it's just going to set you back and reduce your yields because you just won't get as many flowers. And not because it causes less flowers, just because our season isn't long enough. Okay, so there was one study I looked at, and this was from Tanzania. Unfortunately, a lot of the tomato studies are from much warmer climates, such as Africa, and which is fine. We can still use the info from that and translate it into garden stuff. But they looked at marketable fruit, meaning fruit, again, that is perfect looking and that people will purchase. So what they noticed is the single leaders, meaning one stem, produce the most marketable fruit, meaning the most uniform size, the most uniform looking, appropriate size, all that sort of stuff. The one that produces the most or the least amount of marketable fruit was the unpruned plant. So the ones that they just let go wild, they didn't narrow it down to 1 or 2 leaders. They they didn't remove any suckers. They kind of just let it do its thing. So the other thing that I found as a very common theme throughout was that the pruned plants were able to produce fruit sooner than those of which were not pruned, meaning 0 pruning done. The one with 2 leaders, I didn't find anything that would have been like significant to, I guess, say that it delayed the flower. There's like, because you still have that main leader that you're still pruning, which I'll show you how to do it here in a little bit. So you're probably thinking, what does that mean? Because you have more leaves, you'd think that there'd be more photosynthesis taking place, which ultimately by biomass, there is more photosynthesis taking place. It's just the effectiveness of that photosynthesis. So essentially, bottom line, the partitioning of carbohydrates was more effective and targeted in the plants that were pruned. So the ones that were unpruned, the photosynthetic efforts, if you will, went into foliage growth and obviously the fruits and flowers, but it was being split into various different corners in the plant, which obviously slows things down. But for the ones that were pruned, it exponentially put an emphasis on that plant becoming more efficient and where its carbohydrates from photosynthesis ended up, and they actually focused it onto the fruiting plants. Now, with that being said, in this case for Tanzania, because their growing season is much longer than ours, they did get more fruit off of the unpruned plant total, but the fruit that was developed on the unpruned plant actually was later and matured much later than that of the pruned plant. So if you are in an environment where it's going to get cold and the tomatoes aren't going to be able to make it, it's probably in your interest to prune. Now, whether you go with 1 liter or 2 liter, that's up to you. But ultimately, you would want to prune those suckers off because it's going to give you an earlier harvest, which is necessary if you don't have the growing season to sustain an indeterminate tomato indefinitely. So now let's look at exactly how to prune for 2 liters. Okay, this is our plant. These suckers are in kind of these corners here. You did not know So this right here is an example of a sucker. So you have, this is your main leaf, this is your main stem, and now you have kind of this little stem growing inside of the corner. This will turn into a stem similar to this, and it's going to be a leading edge, so it's going to have its own little edge as well. Now, the second sucker, if you wanted to do it that way, would be at the base. You don't want it too high up, because if it's too high up, then it's going to mature much later and it will flower much later. So we want to choose something that's already well on its way to success, So this one right here would be a good one to keep. So to do 2 liters, I'm just going to leave this. And once it begins to grow, I will button it up against this stake. So it eventually goes up the trellis all the way, rather than spilling down. So I'm going to leave this guy, but everything else in these corners is going to get removed. And these, yes, you can just pop them in the soil and they will eventually turn into tomatoes, but it's just, again, depending on your growing season, it may or may not be worth it. For me, it's definitely not worth it because it takes too darn long. Okay, I'm gonna do this one. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Watch me forget to water those and they're just gonna die. You may want to check out my video on tomato planting depth and why you may choose not to plant your tomatoes deeply if you live in a cold climate. It's a neat idea. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.